Everyone again to the 2024 IEEE Online Forum on Climate Change Technologies, and we thank for all the participants for participating in the event. And for some of the reminders, and please submit your questions to the comments to the chat box whenever you in the middle of a talk, whenever you have them. And again, we will not share the copies of the presentation, but will be shared later when you check back up the website. So I'm happy to introduce our first speaker, our speaker of the session, Davis Bookhart. Davis is currently serving as a senior advisor for sustainability at the Northeastern University, Boston. David has a wealth of experience and leadership roles within the field of sustainable infrastructure development. Prior to joining the Northeastern University, David was a director at the Sustainability Office at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technologies, where he was overseeing the implementation of University Sustainability Master Plan, the Sustainability Smart Campus as a living lab initiative, and a life cycle lab. David was a founding director of the Office of the Sustainability at the Johns Hopkins University. In addition, Davis teaches classes on sustainability management and sustainability thinking, and his teaching mainly aims to develop skills excuse me, and mental framework for addressing a complex problem associated with the sustainability. David holds the master's degree in international affairs from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Tufts University.
Okay, great. All right.
Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you this morning. And thank you for that great introduction. Just to talk a little bit about me, just to get started. As you mentioned, I have joined Northeastern University about 8 months ago. I spent the last 11 years in Hong Kong at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and I was at Johns Hopkins before that. My background originally was in energy and environmental policy. I worked in Washington, D.C. for a number of years for a think tank called the Consumer Energy Council of America. And so that's kind of how I ended up in the sustainability field in the first place, and then got a job in academia, and I've been here ever since. What I'd like to do today is really talk a little bit about the future. How do we anticipate the future? What does it look like from a sustainability point of view, especially in terms of climate, and how we start to make the good decisions that we really need to. We are at a point, as we all know, where the ability to make bad choices is getting more and more limited. When I first got involved in this in the 1990s, it seemed like there was a lot of opportunity to really try new things and test out new ideas, and some will work and some won't work. And because even though climate change was a real crisis emerging, there was time to experiment. And of course, now it feels the opposite. It feels like our backs are against the wall, and we really need to make sure that we're making very good decisions. And of course, the decisions that we're making today in 2024, we'll be living with in 2050. So we don't have a lot of leeway. I work at a university, worked at 3 universities now for over the past 20 years. And even very simple things like swapping out an energy system, putting in new boilers or a chiller for air conditioning, those decisions will outlast our climate targets, which are 2040, because a chiller can last 25 years easily. So we need to be making good decisions today, not waiting until they come up. So I have 4 themes or 3 themes that I wanted to go through today. We'll go through and we can discuss these as we go. But the first one is just how fast things change. I wanted to share just a couple of slides. I got back from a series of meetings in Dubai about 2 weeks ago, and I've been there a few times, and it just always shocks me to look at what you see in that beautiful city and realize that every single thing that you see, 99% of what you see, has been built within the last 30 years. And it's just remarkable when you see these old pictures. 1991, there was very, very little there. Well, everything has been accelerated to the point where it's almost mind-boggling. Getting a little closer to my old home in Shenzhen, just across the border from Hong Kong, that was a very similar situation. 1990, Shenzhen was really a little fishing village right on the the edge of the river that separated Hong Kong from mainland China. And today, Shenzhen, I believe, is somewhere around 17, 18 million people and one of the global hotspots. And so that's how fast things can change. It's very important to keep this in mind because we do forget sometimes that this kind of change, because we see it happening on a daily basis, we don't see it happening. We don't wake up 30 years later and see the change, but it's happening quickly. So what does it look like for us? So let's just take a stroll backwards in time and look at where we were 30 years ago. Some of you may remember some of these things. We didn't have cell phones. We had cell boxes. You could carry it with you. Typically, we refer to car phones because you needed the battery of the car to be able to power the telecommunication device. And of course, because they were so intensive, we all carried around these things called beepers. You would get a beep from your pocket, and then you'd run off to a payphone. Of course, payphones, I don't think really exist today either. This is what computers look like. You can see on the left-hand side, you may remember, you might have had one of these where the hard drive was actually outside of the computer itself. And you had to put in the DOS startup disk just to get the computer going. Of course, we would listen to our music in much different ways. Now, this is in my lifetime. My kids would not recognize any of these things. My kids are 17 and 20 years old. It's just mind-boggling for them to even think about this. In fact, I remember when my younger son was growing up, he would ask questions like, Dad, what kinds of games did you play on your phone when you were my age? And it's just this idea that things have transformed so quickly that as kids are growing up, it's really quite remarkable for them to even think about how we may have lived, without cell phones and without the internet, but it was certainly not that long ago. I like to just kind of go through this. This is in the 1990s. My grandmother was born in 1901, so I always think of her life in terms of this rapid, accelerated technological advancements. She was born in 1901, and so when she was born, she actually predated the advent of the airplane. It had not begun yet. The Wright brothers had not had their initial flight in North Carolina. And so that would have been right about the time she was a couple of years old. But by the time she was in her 20s, we had gone from a short experimental flight to an ability for a person to get in an airplane and fly all the way across the Atlantic Ocean without stopping. By the time she was in her 40s, we had gone not only from the ability to fly across the Atlantic, but we'd actually gotten to the point where we could fly faster than the speed of sound. We'd broken the sound barrier. And then finally, by the time she retired and was able to sit back and enjoy reflecting back on her life, we had landed a man on the moon, or multiple people on the moon. Now that's remarkable. That is in one lifespan. And it's just, I think that if she were to reflect on all of this, she probably wouldn't have seen this as a major change, but she would have recognized that there were these milestones along the way that really went from something that felt very, primitive by today's standards to, extremely sophisticated and technological. Being able to take a rocket ship and put a person on the moon and return them to Earth safely is quite a feat. So if we fast forward, what does it look like, for us? I did a quick search just to look at the top companies in the world. When I was growing up, we had these blue chip companies. There was ExxonMobil and there was GE. I realized that now the top, 5 or 6 of the top 10 companies in the world did not even exist in 1990. So we're talking about NVIDIA, Alphabet, which is Google, Meta, which is Facebook, Amazon, Tesla, TSMC, none of those were around. And of course, there are 2 others that are older than 30 years old, but they still feel very, very new. So that's Apple and Microsoft. We still kind of consider them to be modern iterations of of business, of kind of modern technologies. So this is what we're looking at. So the question then really is, how does this go into the future? And can we start to anticipate all this rapid disruptive changes? And how does it help us make better decisions so that we are, thinking about things like climate change, these global challenges, these grand challenges, and making, better decisions, kind of anticipatory. In my world, in sustainability, we often say that we can either be strategic or reactive. Those are two different sides of the same coin in many ways. Strategic means that we're trying to look at the situation, trying to understand the trends and anticipate future challenges and try to be one step ahead. Reactive is exactly the opposite. Reactive is what we did during COVID. When COVID came, we didn't know what to do. We weren't prepared for it as the way that we should be. We made it through. Reactive, you can still, you can still get things done, but you're not being strategic. You're not being very intentional about what happens. And the consequences can be quite dire. So we did get through COVID. I think it was probably one of the greatest achievements of the last decade to be able to consolidate the technological expertise of the world to develop vaccines for this real global threat. But we did so in ways that really did a tremendous amount of damage and created lots of unintended consequences. So as of 2022, the stats were, and this is, I'm sure it's much higher today, but the stats suggested that there were 1.5 billion disposable masks in the ocean. Those are ones that had either gotten swept away, they'd been thrown in the wrong place, they ended up in a river, they floated out to sea. That's 1.5 billion. That's a problem that we'll have to deal with for the next decade or so. It's very hard to clean up things after the fact than it is to prevent it before the fact. So how do we be more strategic instead of being reactive, instead of cleaning up after ourselves? So there's one more thing that we need to talk about before we can get to that, which is that it turns out that human beings generally are very, very bad at thinking about the future. So why is this? What makes us so bad? Sometimes I'll do a little experiment with my students in the class, and I'll just ask them to, and I say, we're basically, it's not just looking in the future. We're actually not very good at looking in the past either. Our memories are just not designed to be able to handle that. And we don't do it naturally. Some people are very taken by that, but unless you really train yourself to be thinking as a historian, be looking at the past, or as a futurist looking into the future, we typically don't do that very well. And the exercise I do with my students is I ask them to raise their hand if they know what their mother's name. Of course, everybody knows their mother's name. So everyone raises their hand. And then I'll say, do you know what your mother's name, your grandmother? And most of them will raise their hand. Of course, I know my grandmother. And then you go one more generation. Do you know your mother's name? And about half the hands drop down. And you realize that's just 3 generations back. And of course, you go one more generation, then of course, most people have no idea. Now, that's our own family history. That seems to be something that should be quite personal to us. We should really know where we came from, what our family was. We should understand our relatives and our ancestors. But we just really don't do that very well unless we're very intentional. And so if it's very difficult for us to do backwards, looking into history, then it's also quite difficult for us to be thinking 1 or 2 generations in the future. And one of the things that we realize from research is that when scientists are looking at our brain, and different parts will light up as you ask a person a question. If you ask a person about what is, something that's very personal to you, then a certain part of the brain will light up. If you ask the person about someone else, your brother, your sister, a friend, a different part of the brain, because your brain can distinguish who is you and who is someone else. The interesting thing is if you ask about yourself in the future, the same part of the brain lights up as if you're talking about a different person. It's almost like we're disconnected. So there's a number of reasons, I think. I just wanted to show this too, because even for people in my field, you think that sustainability-oriented people would be very good at thinking about the future. But here's 3 different diagrams, including one from the Harvard Business School. And what you notice, all 3 of them are missing any kind of statement about the future. Now we have the 3-legged stool: economic, environmental, social. We have the circles of sustainability that's very sophisticated, looking at ecology and politics and economics. And then the Harvard Business School says in business, sustainability refers to doing business without negatively impacting the environment, community, or society as a whole. But neither one of these 3 have any kind of a statement about over time, right? Making a good decision today so that communities in the future or society in the future is not negatively impacted. So we don't just automatically come to the conclusion that we're trying to think into the future. We have to be very intentional about this. So why is it that we're so bad about thinking in the future? I would suggest that one of the reasons is that we simply evolved over tens of thousands of years in ways where thinking about the future was not that important. For example, most of us came from ancestors who were agrarian, and at most, you would probably need to be thinking 1 season in advance, probably not even that far. You're probably thinking in terms of the growing season, the end of the growing season, and then what you might save for the next one. And so long-term thinking just simply was not that important. I think that there are suggestions that the way that we even interpreted time even 100 or 200 years ago is just very different than the way that we think about time today. We have breaks. We clock in and clock out. Those are really very modern inventions. No one in the medieval Europe or Asia would have been thinking about, I'm going to go into the field and cull the rice, but then at 10 o'clock I'm going to take a pee break. That's just not the way that it worked. So part of our inability to think about the future is just that we were not designed. Our brains really evolved over tens of thousands of years, not thinking about the future, not needing to think about the future, taking a very immediate focus. If there's something that's on fire, you put it out. If a animal is chasing you, you run. We're always really geared towards quick fix thinking instead of long-term strategies. But there's another thing that I'd like to point out too, is that there's research that suggests that not only is it that we're not kind of wired that way, our brains are also designed to try to prevent us from thinking about the future. And so the brain values certainty and treats uncertainty and the inability to predict the future as a source of deep discomfort, right? We don't know what will happen over the next year. And if I obsess about it, that would make me very, very uncomfortable. So again, our brains play a little bit of a trick on us. It's not just that we fail to plan for future events. Uncertainty is so averse that our brains create a false certainty about the future, making the assumption that the things that will always be the way that they are now. This is a bias fittingly known as the end of history illusion. I think this makes a lot of sense when we think about how stressed and anxious we would be if we really started to think about how rapidly the future is changing and what that means for me and my job and my kids and everything else. So we can see how kind of anticipating things continuing to be the same. Now, this study right here was done, and the interesting outcome was that they asked quite a number of people across all age groups about what kinds of changes they had seen in their lifetime. And even young people, 18-year-olds, are saying, oh my gosh, you should have seen when I was a kid. I remember I used to do this. Now things are so different. And then, of course, I think the oldest in their survey group was in their 70s. And of course, they had seen massive changes as well. And so across the board, I think there was great consensus that a lot of changes happened in my life Some of it quite disruptive, some of it quite, quite like this, at that step change disruptive level. But then the following questions were, so what do you think will happen over the next 10 years? And almost across the board, most people said, I think that it'll probably be very similar to today. Right? So this is the conclusion that even though we intuitively know that change is happening quickly, we don't think in terms of how those rapid changes will continue into the future. So the end of history illusion. It doesn't mean that we can't overcome that. And so what I often will encourage our students to be thinking about is that none of the mindset biases or heuristics or things that we have that tend to lead us in one direction, which is typically an unsustainable direction, none of those are locked in stone. You can train yourself, just like you can train yourself to drive a car. You can train yourself to do very sophisticated, mathematics. You can also train yourself to unbundle yourself from some of these biases, like the end of history illusion, by training yourself to look at different things. So, so let me go into what some of those strategies would be. So we do have tools to help us plan for the future, focusing on drivers, focusing on uncertainties, and then really looking at weak signals. I put this picture in here because there are lots of examples of people who were able to overcome these end of future fallacies and think very creatively. I love this picture because this is a prediction of the future of education, 1935, so almost 100 years ago. And essentially what they're showing is what we're doing today. This is a Zoom call, I think, for a lack of better description. You could see that there's a professor speaking into a transmitter. He has a blackboard. I guess they call that a blackboard, but that's basically our computer screen. It's going out over the internet and being received by people who can see what he has on the board, and through loudspeakers, they can hear him speak. Well, in 1935, that must have seemed absolutely outrageous, but some people had great ideas that really did predict some of the future in ways that were quite accurate. Okay, so if we're looking into the tools, some of we're looking for trends, we're looking for ways that we might focus our attention. We do know that there's quite a number of great studies that are out there, just paying attention to what, for example, the Oxford University Principles for Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsetting, really showing how some of the things that we're doing right now, we can continue to do, investing in avoided fossil carbon, trying to get emissions with the low risk of reversal. So that's essentially talking about, planting a tree will eliminate or will absorb some carbon dioxide, but trees have a limited lifespan, and at some point they will die, and so that carbon will go in. And so we need to be going into the blue area, which is the carbon removal with the lowest risk of reversal. And it shows that we do have a pathway where we can continue in some of these as we're starting to build, the real premium types of carbon removal, which is that long-term storage. I think we also know, this is from my old university, just looking at data. So of course, we're all talking about AI today, but really what AI is based on is good quality data. And so in terms of buildings or campuses, we really recognize that some of these things, like building a smart backbone of data for the buildings and being able to analyze the performance of different systems, sub-meter everything. The days of having a building standing alone with one master meter, those days really have to be over. We could put sub-meters, and of course they're cheaper now than ever. And really be looking at all the different types of data that can be generated inside of buildings, the people flows, temperature, humidity levels. You could, electricity, of course, plug loads, really breaking it down so that we can start to incorporate that large amount of data into some big data models to really be able to optimize and use things like AI. So that we can optimize our energy performance and reduce our carbon emissions. Here's here's a graph that my colleague here at the university put together, just looking at sustainability in 2050. You could look at this and say, these are all things that probably are areas that we need to be focusing on right now, as a matter of fact. Materials, policies, laws, social mores, business models, it all fits together. So the question then is, how does this fit over time? How does this fit? How do we know that things are going to be, how do we predict how policies and laws and social mores and business models, how are they going to be influencing designs, and how do those designs address things like waste reduction, cost of production, local expectations, water travel? And then how does that also, in a separate bucket, really look at the energy, zero carbon resources, and so forth? Well, so let's take a quick example. So here is a definition of the future of sustainability. This definition came from ChatGPT. So I thought, well, let's see how well AI can do. And I thought it's not a bad definition of the future of sustainability research, focusing on things like AI, blockchain to optimize their resource management, prioritize circular economy models. I think this is a huge piece. And then looking at social economic, with environmental concerns and so forth. Okay, I highlighted the circular economy model because I wanted to use that as our example. So if we are trying to anticipate the future, and we know that a circular economy is something that is very likely to be the kind of model that we would need to shift from this linear economic supply and demand model today to something that's a little bit more in tune with the planetary boundary, then can we also start using that as a way to look at the barriers and uncertainties? So, for example, what is the influence of the consumer in the future? How are they influencing this cycle? What's the influence of regulations and government intervention? And what's the influence of the disruptive technologies? So this circular economy is not controversial. I think we would all agree that this is a great way to go. We're using less natural resources. We're minimizing our waste to the landfill. But we have to anticipate, what are these three things in the future, and how do they look? And what will it do for us? So we could start to just plot this out. So looking at consumer demands, and again, even on a spreadsheet, if we're looking in terms of increasing or decreasing, what are we seeing about consumer demands? Well, we know that environmental priorities are going up. I think that we're starting to see things like anger at retailers for not helping with end-of-life disposal. So if you buy a product, then you as the consumer are the one who's responsible for figuring out how to deal with it at the end of its life. Well, that's not really fair. And I think I'm starting to see a lot more consumers are shifting that burden back over to the manufacturers or to designers. If you sell me something, I want you to help me with the end of life. Which also means that we're starting to see a little bit of a shift to things like renting and leasing instead of buying. So, for example, if I need a baby stroller, I really don't want to buy one. I'm only going to use it for a couple of years, and then I'm kind of stuck with this, and it's probably still in good shape. If I could just lease that for a couple of years at a decent price, then that could go back to the manufacturer. They could polish it back up again, and they could lease it again for another 3 years. It's a beautiful way of being able to use a circular economy approach. Okay, regulatory drivers. Of course, none of these things are static. Even though we think that things may not change much, we do know that the cost of carbon, human rights, equity, environmental concerns, those are driving regulations, new laws across all regions. We know the global trade balances and access to export markets will be changing as well, and partly because of human rights violations. So looking at the center of Africa as this free zone for collecting as much materials for cheap as possible, those days are probably coming to an end, which is good because they come with a lot of negative impacts. And then, of course, just the resource availability. We have one planet, and there's only so much that can go around. And as externalities start to be built into the cost structure, then we will definitely see quite a bit of those costs shifting. And then technology drivers, we should really be thinking about how AI, automation, quantum computing, synthetic biology, which is an amazing field that we're talking about AI today, but I think synthetic biology is probably what we'll be talking about in a few years, because synthetic biology can actually build some of the things that we need. There's really fascinating research on using biology or certain types of organisms to actually create building materials that can be used for insulation or for roofing or even structures. And then looking at those technology gaps. So if we think about the kind of these static models, but then we put them in terms of uncertainties and disruptions, that gives us a lot more confidence to think about which directions we're moving in. So finally, let me just go into the last piece. So there is this concept about weak signals. What do we see today that is helpful in giving us some insights into the way things are going? So this is a weak signal. So in Tamil Nadu, there was a kind of a local outpouring of support for basically banning and avoiding carbonated drinks, not just necessarily just to help with local products, but there was also there are water issues in this region in India. And the question was, why would we give all this precious water to a multinational company so that they could make these sugary drinks when we could use that water? It's much better for us to use that water for our own local irrigation, our own local agriculture. This to me feels like a weak signal. I think we're going to see more like this. There are companies that will start to feel the pinch of the way that they're actually conducting their own business models in ways because they're either very energy intensive or water intensive. We'll start to see. So I think this is a weak signal. We're going to start to see a lot more pushback on companies because of water. Here's an interesting weak signal. So why are we starting to see more and more signs about no drones, a no drone zone? Is it because people are worried about their privacy? Is it because they don't like the noise? Is it because they feel like people are taking advantage of them by flying these drones around? I'm not sure, but I think this is a weak signal too. And I think this definitely will play into what we might be seeing in the future in terms of how we're using some of these technologies. Like, did we get to the use of a technology so fast that we didn't allow society to catch up and kind of embrace it? And then that created a backlash. We talked a little bit about cryptocurrencies. For anyone who's in higher education, you probably remember that MOOCs, these massive online open courses, were supposed to revolutionize, and they actually did have some good impacts, but maybe not the kind of disruptive impact to higher education than we thought. I would say these are also weak signals. These are actually forecasts, but these are showing us that we tend to be much less or much more conservative about our predictions than reality. The one on the right is really shocking to me, but this is really what we were predicting. You could see the yellow lines, or that's the capacity that we thought we would have, and then the black line is what actually happened. So at every single step of the stage, we really underpredicted what we thought we could do. So that's a weak signal as well. So there's something in the way that we're looking at technologies. We're not very good at being able to kind of anticipate the rapid change that industry can make. So just one last example here, just looking at weak signals. I'm going to use hydrogen as a an example, because of course, over the past 2 or 3 years, we've been hearing a lot about hydrogen is really going to be the savior. And so let's take a closer look at it and see if we can think of some of the kind of these future thinking tools. Now, hydrogen has been referred to as the Swiss Army knife. It can do so many different things. It can be used for chemicals, processes, power, heat. It can be used for transport, aviation, shipping. Everyone seems to have their hand out looking for some hydrogen or anticipating that hydrogen is going to revolutionize their own industry. But as you can see, there's a lot of people looking at this, and so one of the systems questions would be, can the supply of hydrogen really fulfill all of these expectations from all of these different industries? And there doesn't seem to be a lot of consensus. Now, in some cases, for example, the IEA says that hydrogen is today enjoying unprecedented momentum. The world should not miss this unique chance to make hydrogen an important part of our clean and secure energy future. McKinsey was also quite bullish, despite some uncertainties across scenarios. Global clean hydrogen demand is projected to grow significantly to 2050, but infrastructure scale-up and technology advancements are needed to meet projected demand. So still very bullish, but kind of cautionary that we have a lot of infrastructure to build. And at the same time, we have others who are saying maybe all of this focus on hydrogen is a little bit more of hype than reality. When I was working in Washington, D.C. 25 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about which car was going to be the clean car of the future. Would it be a hydrogen fuel cell driven car or an electric car? Well, of course, I think we've got the answer to that now. I think the battery electric cars have come down the cost curve to a point where they're financially viable, and they are really dominating this market. And then going to the other extreme, hydrogen is not a fuel, it's a cult. All right, so the truth is somewhere in the middle. We have to try to dissect this so that we can make good decisions about how we go forward. Again, looking at the Swiss Army knife of where hydrogen is and what it can do, but recognizing that it takes a lot of energy to be able to split those hydrogen and oxygen atoms. So really, it's not just what potential hydrogen is. We really need to look at the bottlenecks and think about what could be done. Now, I love this. This is called a hydrogen ladder, and I love this because the authors essentially said, we do have the Swiss Army knife. Everybody would like to be able to utilize hydrogen, but the fact is, because there's going to be a limited demand for so much, we may need to think about how we prioritize. Now, prioritizing could be through market mechanisms, it could be through regulation, it could be a combination of both. But what they had done is they put together this list and said, those at the top in the A range, those kinds of technologies really need to be prioritized above everything else. Everything down at the bottom in the EFG range, those are kind of nice to have, but probably not very realistic. And not realistic, perhaps because what DNV in their recent report, Hydrogen Forecast to 2050, they essentially said that we find that hydrogen is likely to satisfy just 5% of the global energy demand by 2050. So 5%, that's not going to be the revolutionary kind of fuel carrier of the future that will be able to solve all of our problems. In fact, Europe, it's estimated that they may be the highest, 11%, down to North America and China at 6%. And then, of course, other parts of the world may be less than that. We know that sometimes we're not as good at predicting. So let's just double these. Let's say that Europe is 20% and OECD is 15 or 16%. Maybe the overall goes to 10%. That's still a very small slice. It means that people are going to be really competing very heavily for the ability to capture that hydrogen, which means that hydrogen is going to be very expensive. So here's one way that we can look at predicting we're trying to make some sense of how we move forward in the future, looking at hydrogen. If we plot this out, here are 4 different futures, let's say. These are 4 different ways that we might see hydrogen in 2050. And on one hand, we may have very aggressive local and global climate regulations that are driving this clean hydrogen push, driving clean energy, renewables, and really driving the fossil fuel industry out of the mix. On the other extreme, at the bottom of the axis, would be reliance on market signals. We may end up in a future where we say we don't want the government to try to pick winners and losers. Let's let the market do that. On the x-axis, we could say, well, let's try to think about whether or not we have predictable incremental technological advances. Things are continuing to advance at a rate that we think makes sense. Or the extreme opposite of that might be rapid disruptive technological advancements. So if we do this, then you can see there's 4 different quadrants. And of course, you can make this 2x2 graph and using many different scenarios. But what we're really trying to do is we're trying to get a sense of what do these different futures look like under these circumstances. And what it would suggest is that if the technology is going at a relatively predictable incremental rate, and we're really focusing on market signals, then things like fertilizer, methanol, steel production, the industries that can afford to spend as much as they need to be able to get the hydrogen, they're probably going to win that battle, because the others just simply may not be able to compete with that higher level of. Now, how about if there's aggressive regulations, maybe even regulations with some subsidies, regulations that put some limits on what can and can't be done? Well, in that kind of case, then maybe we're looking at things like a lot more of this hydrogen is going into aviation as one of the few options that the aviation industry really has. And the regulations will help facilitate that. Chemical feedstock, CO2 remediations, you can see those really being influenced by regulations. And of course, they would really depend on some rapid and disruptive technologies. And you can go through each of these individually and really build a story about what that future looks like. So we might have more green ammonia, green methanol in this quadrant. We may have something that looks more like long-term energy storage in this way, because the storage technologies are increasing, but we're still relying on the market signals to help support it as opposed to regulations. So all of these give us an idea of how we might be able to think in terms of different scenarios and then start to plan. Hopefully we can start to make better decisions today that will be able to take us into the climate constrained future. So let me stop there. I just wanted to reiterate the 3 themes. The future is unpredictable. We're very bad at anticipating it. And we do have tools to help us plan. And these are just 3 tools of a very much larger toolbox that help us to understand what we have. So let me stop here and take some questions.
Thank you, Davis, for the insightful talk. I know we have time for take some questions to Davis. Okay, I'll begin. I have a question. You mentioned about synthetic biology holds a good future in view of sustainability. Could you give a context and what you meant by that?
Yeah, so synthetic biology is essentially starts with the idea that nature does things that are significantly better than the way that we do things. So if you look at a spider web, I don't remember the exact specifications, but a spider web is essentially by weight stronger than steel. Now, how is it that you can create a material that's stronger than steel without a blast furnace and without incredible amounts of energy? And in my last university, we had a project where the researchers essentially started with a tree, and they said if you look at a tree can get a very large volume of water from the ground all the way up 20 or 30 meters into the air without an electric pump, without any kind of energy. So how is it they're able to get that water all the way up through? If we can learn from some of those, then we may be able to, um, solve some of these in much more effective ways than the types of technology that we have now that kind of overpowers. So synthetic biology is essentially looking at ways that we can replicate um, some of the systems. We already see some in place. For example, if you've ever had Impossible Meat, the kind of this meat substitute, that was based on um, kind of reverse engineering what makes meat taste good, what makes it attractive to us, and they were able to kind of dissect it from a chemical point of view, and they were able to identify the exact components that give it the taste, the flavor, and the kinds of things that make a hamburger taste good. And they said, well, we can take those things. They don't have to come from meat. They could actually come from soybeans or from other types of materials. And then if we concentrate it in the right way, we can actually create something that tastes almost exactly like meat without actually using meat. In terms of energy, some of the most exciting areas of synthetic biology are looking at how we can grow specific types of organisms in ways that um, they can create the materials for us. So fungi, for example, is something that a lot of interest in looking at fungi because it's very dense and it grows and it kind of is turns out it's a great insulation. And if you can kind of grow it in the right way and make sure that it stops and it doesn't keep going, then you could actually fill in the interior cavities of walls and so forth. You could do it in a much more efficient way without some of the damage.
Right. Thanks, Davis. I think we have some more questions from this participant, so I'll look at the
Okay.
chat box. Charlie asked, you mentioned a number of hydrogen storage applications. So he's asking, is there a specific disruptive technology that you're following? Uh, you mentioned future thinning techniques. What are some of the ebooks or authors? Okay, thinking techniques. Okay.
In terms of hydrogen storage.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Well, so as thinking, I mean, hydrogen really is basically a battery, right? It is a storage medium. And so the question is, are there ways, uh, I think that what we would be looking at is hydrogen storage as a substitute for a chemical battery. And so for electricity frequency regulation, for example, a battery works quite well, but perhaps we might find that using hydrogen, storing that energy and then being able to use it when you need it for frequency regulation might make more sense, depending on where they are.
So do you think the lithium batteries will be replaced by hydrogen-based batteries? That could be the possibility in future? Oh.
Well, I don't know. I think that what I would say is that if so in that scenario, I think that what we would be seeing is that there would be certain situations where, because of the regulations, we might find that storage might make more sense than the lithium batteries. Lithium batteries are quite good for mobility, but we might find that hydrogen might be a better storage medium for larger scale frequency regulation, for example.
All right. We have one more question from Kathy. You talked about the prevalence of hydrogen as an energy source. Where do you see wind, solar, and water, the sustainable technologies?
Well, yeah, so hydrogen is not an energy source. I think that's what we really have to make sure we remind people. It's a storage medium. So think of hydrogen the way that you think of electricity or the way that you think of a battery. You have to use energy to create it. And so by using energy to create the hydrogen, then it can't, by definition, it can't be a source. Um, so what you're basically doing is you're converting one type of energy into a different type of energy. And by splitting the hydrogen from the oxygen, you're creating something that's useful. So what I would say is that the wind and solar and hydro and any other are absolutely essential for creating the hydrogen that we would be using in the future. Because the way that hydrogen is being produced right now is usually through a reforming process. We use natural gas, and then you can split off that way, but we're still using natural gas. So if we're to go to a clean energy future, we really have to avoid using hydrogen that's created in certain ways and move towards hydrogen that's created through renewables. There's a number of different ways to create hydrogen, but it seems like electrolysis seems to be the one that's the most likely. It's what we use the most right now. The problem is, though, that by using good, clean, renewable energy to create hydrogen, it's a zero-sum game, right? If you use that wind power to create hydrogen, you're not using that wind power in the electric grid to power the cities and to power the buildings. So I think what I'm reading is that it seems like there are certain places that will be renewables abundant. So Iceland, for example, they just had almost this unlimited amount of geothermal energy coming up from their underground, lava beds, and so they could generate just tons and tons of renewable energy, much, much more than they need for such a small country. But if they can use that abundance of renewables to create hydrogen, then maybe that hydrogen could be brought somewhere else and used. There may be some places where we have a lot of wind power, but in the United States, in the Midwest, in Iowa, probably a lot more potential for wind than the actual amount that they need in those locations. And so in those, you would be using the renewables to create the hydrogen. The issue that would have to be resolved, though, is that if you're creating hydrogen in a place where you don't really need the energy, then you have to have an energy transport system. It could be, pipelines. Some of the ways of moving hydrogen are not very efficient, so freezing it down to, I think it's, minus 180 or over 200 minus Celsius. I mean, that takes a lot of energy just to do that. And then, of course, you're losing some of the energy as well.
Right. And of course, miniaturization also is another direction, which for portable electronics, you want to use hydrogen storage as a battery.
Yes. Yeah. So actually, that's a great example. That's a good one because that's something where it's, the large amounts of hydrogen are not necessary for these, the miniaturized devices. But then they would be able to really provide that energy input for larger.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's good. That's a good example.
And I think Charlie's following the question. I think his question related to you're saying that we as a human being has a barrier to think for the future. So you were saying future thinking techniques. I mean, he's asking, is there any popular books available? I mean, what are some books or authors that I could look at it?
Yes, there are definitely some people. Actually, I have one right here. I really appreciate this. I don't know if you could see, but it's a woman named Jane McGonigal. The name of the book is Imaginable, and the reason why she uses that as a term was that she did a quick search, a Google search, I suppose, and she found, I don't remember the number, but millions of news articles that all had, it was unimaginable, unthinkable, and so the question is, why are some of the things that are happening so frequently, why are they so unimaginable? It's maybe a reflection of their inability to imagine that this is possible. There are things, I mean, we're seeing some horrible natural disasters happening around the world, and we say that, gosh, that's unthinkable, that's unimaginable. So how do we get from, and that's reactive, so when I was talking about the two ends of the extreme, you have strategic and you have reactive. Well, reactive is something happens and you say, oh my gosh, I couldn't believe, I can't imagine that could have happened. We need to get ourselves to the point where we do imagine that happening and we're predicting and we're trying to stay one step ahead. So anyway, this woman is quite interesting. She's a researcher at Stanford, or not. I guess she's affiliated with Stanford, but she's a part of something called the Future. The Institute for the Future. It's a nonprofit in Palo Alto, California. The interesting thing about her is that she's actually a game designer, which I think in some cases probably really helped her, just trying to think ahead, what would be a great game? What's something that might be fun to do? And just having that creative mindset probably allowed her to, to think very carefully. But there's quite a number of ways. And McKinsey was the consulting company that really coined this term of weak signals. And so they have quite a bit of information on that. The future thinking, if someone is a future thinker, they call them a futurist. And sometimes that has kind of a funny connotation. You think of a futurist as someone who's kind of wacky and, saying the end is coming. But the fact is there are some good tools that are very useful for helping us just take all of this data and trying to organize it in ways that can be useful for decision making.
Because we have time for one more question, so I'll from the chat box. It's from Thakur. People are talking about sustainability, but it's going in more unstable. What do you think when it will be sustainable?
So sustainability is unstable. Well, if I understand the question, here's what I think. I think that one of the biggest changes that I see at the university right now is that we're talking about sustainability in different ways than we did before. So this past hour, I've been talking about tools that we can use to try to predict the future better, which is of course, is very important from a sustainability point of view. We have to be able to do that better. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when we were teaching about sustainability, we were teaching much more about the content. How many parts per million of CO2 are in the atmosphere, biodiversity, there's a number of different things, water scarcity and so forth, the Anthropocene. Today, I think that we're teaching this much more in terms of skills. So future thinking is one of the top skills that we really try for anyone who's interested in sustainability. Systems thinking, just looking at what are the ways that we can solve a problem without creating, an unanticipated outcome, like 1.5 billion disposable masks in the ocean. So future thinking, life cycle thinking, systems thinking, putting these into a value proposition. That's really one of the ways that we start to focus on sustainability. And I think that in doing so, we're able to provide a platform for training that goes across all disciplines. And so I think to answer that question, once we start, kind of making sustainability thinking kind of the norm for everyone going into whatever field they're going in, if it's medicine or health or engineering, they're bringing that sustainability mindset with them. And I think that's when we go from unsustainable to sustainable.
All right. Thank you, Davis, for the insightful talk. And I think if any questions further, I think the speaker can reach out to you directly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.